Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Mark Back with MWB Communications. I'm providing some PR support for some of the organizations represented on today's call, and I'll also be moderating the Q&A portion of this conference. We're really excited to talk about this important topic with all of you today. With us today is John Ketzenberger, Director of Government Relations at the Nature Conservancy, Dr. Indra Frank, Director of Environmental Health and Water Policy at Hoosier Environmental Council, Kyle Rora, Director of Public Policy at Ducks Unlimited, Matt Mearsman, River Basin Program Director at Michiana Area Council of Governments, Jill Hoffman, Executive Director at the White River Alliance, and Rodney Rulon, who is a Central Indiana farmer. Spellings for each of their names are available in the media advisory. If you do not have a copy of the media advisory, please send me an email and I'd be happy to provide that for you. My email address is already in the chat. I've also posted a link to a Google Drive folder that contains photos that you can use, as well as a copy of the letter delivered to the governor this morning. Mr. Ketzenberger of the Nature Conservancy is going to start us off and introduce our speakers. Each speaker is going to provide a brief statement, and then we're going to open the floor for questions. I will ask that everybody please mute their microphones unless it is your turn to ask a question, just so that we can keep us moving here in the next hour. If you would like to ask a question for members of the media, please indicate that in the chat function, along with the media outlet that you're representing, and I'll be happy to call on you, at which point you can unmute your microphone and address the speakers. If you are interested in additional interviews with one or more of the panelists, please let me know via email, and I'd be happy to arrange that after the conference today. We are also going to be recording this meeting. We're recording now, and I can provide that recording to you upon request, so that you can cut footage of the speakers for your stories. So at this time, I'm going to pass the virtual mic on to Mr. Ketzenberger of the Nature Conservancy. John?
Hey, Mark, thanks very much. I appreciate that. And thank you for all the work that you've done. Welcome again to everyone who has joined us on this call, and we appreciate your attendance. We do believe that this is an important event and situation, and we appreciate your interest in it. I just wanted to say that for a few minutes here, talk about the fact that I'm joined by a bunch of people who know wetlands from many perspectives. And we also represent 110 signatories, including 104 organizations representing tens of thousands of Hoosiers. The letter, which you should have, is signed by all of those folks. This issue affects all corners of the state, with repercussions for all residents and businesses. And that's why we come before you today. As some of you know, I followed the General Assembly for a long time, and what I saw in the Senate Environmental Affairs Committee in January was really shocking. A bill to repeal all regulation of wetlands moved after a single 2-hour meeting. And although more than a dozen people signed up on short notice to testify against it, including Farmer Ray McCormick, who drove over from Vincennes in poor weather, exactly one person was able to testify because the sponsors ran the clock on representatives of the Indiana Department of Environmental Management and the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. Despite opposition from prominent Republicans, the Senate rammed the bill through within the week. They didn't even bother to hide their disdain for wetlands or the thoughtful or meaningful legislative process. House leaders promised to slow the process down, and they did do that. But the 90 organizations and the thousands of Hoosiers we represent were shut out of the negotiations until the very end. It was only after we elbowed our way into the process with a memo asserting the value of wetlands, their function, and reasonable concrete alternatives to a full repeal sought by proponents that we were finally heard. Representative Hal Slager and Representative David Abbott, who hail from areas of the state where wetlands are well understood for their value, used this information as a basis for a new amendment, one that was finally adopted in the House committee. However, a pair of second reading amendments gutted regulation on all Class 1 and much of Class 2 wetlands and poisoned the compromise that had been reached. We often hear legislators say the process matters, and we, the 110 organizations and individuals who signed this letter, agree. The rushed, exclusive nature of this process minimized the role of experts and ended with a bad act. This is the act we ask Governor Holcomb to veto as soon as possible. So with that, I'll turn this over to Matt Mearsman, who's director of the St. Joseph River Basin Commission. Matt?
Thanks, John. Our commission was created by the Indiana General Assembly to address water quality and flooding concerns in the St. Joseph River of Lake Michigan. Despite the loss of more than half of its historic wetlands, the St. Joe River remains one of the most stable rivers in the state. That is largely due to the fact that every other river in Indiana has lost even more wetlands than we have. Our basin is also blessed with hundreds of beautiful lakes, and they all rely on wetlands upstream to keep them clean. Simply speaking, we have the most to lose if wetlands are deregulated. After studying our basin extensively, we found a direct connection between drainage costs, flooding problems, and wetland loss. Wetlands act like sponges. They store and filter water. Every gallon of water captured by a wetland is one less gallon we have to pay to manage. Our communities are already struggling to deal with the water we have now. Their efforts to mitigate flood hazards, protect public health, and maintain drainage water infrastructure would be canceled out by additional wetland losses. Although our river is one of the healthiest in the state, the cities of South Bend, Elkhart, and Goshen have all experienced major flooding multiple times in the last 5 years. Rural landowners are paying more than ever in taxes to maintain the capacity of our county ditches and drain tiles. At the same time, city residents are facing crippling utility bills to support the construction of tanks and tunnels to store and treat increased stormwater runoff. Our 32-member commission consists of mayors, county commissioners, county surveyors, health officers, and soil and water conservation districts from 6 counties. These local government officials include doctors, farmers, biologists, and engineers. They are rural and urban landowners. While they are all from different walks of life, there was consensus among them that this bill is bad for all of us. They recognize there are some problems with our wetland regulations, but this legislation does not address those problems. Therefore, we are urging the governor to veto Senate Enrolled Act 389 and create a wetlands task force to give this critical issue the time, attention, and stakeholder input it deserves.
Thank you, Matt. Now we'll turn to Dr. Indra Frank, who directs environmental health and water policy for the Hoosier Environmental Council, to discuss how wetland regulations are based on science and consistency. Indra?
Thank you, John, and thank you all for being here today. Senate Enrolled Act 389 eliminates protection for Class 1 wetlands and significantly reduces protection for Class 2. The Indiana Department of Environmental Management estimates that Class 1 represent more than 50% of Indiana's remaining wetlands, and Class 2 represent around 40%. So this bill leaves the majority of state jurisdictional wetlands in jeopardy and could impact 500,000 acres of wetlands or more. There has been a myth circulating at the State House that it's okay to remove protection from these wetlands because they have no value. This is false. Wetlands have tremendous value as part of the overall water system. It's true that Class 1 wetlands are defined in Indiana as having prior human disturbance and as lacking at least one out of a list of wetland functions. But the definition says they lack at least one function. It does not say that they lack all function. All of the Class 1 wetlands retain some of the wetland functions. The Class 2 wetlands have all functions, and those will be lost if this bill becomes law. This myth of valueless wetlands was soundly refuted by wetland scientists from 4 different universities in Indiana who hosted a symposium in February titled "The Value of All Wetlands." 110 diverse organizations and individuals from around the state signed this letter asking Governor Holcomb to veto SEA 389. This coalition includes environmental and conservation groups, lake organizations, river organizations, hunting and fishing groups, civic organizations, faith groups, professional organizations, and municipalities. It represents unprecedented unity. In the letter, the coalition acknowledges that it is time to review and revise Indiana's nearly 20-year-old wetlands law, but not in the way that this bill revises it. This bill revises the law in a harmful way that will cost the state dearly. We want the governor to know that there is a better way. There are policy options that are supported by science that need to be explored. Thank you.
Indra, thank you. We appreciate that. Now I present Rodney Rulon, who is a farmer in Hamilton County and owner of Rulon Enterprises, and he was very helpful to the coalition in understanding a farmer's point of view. Rodney? Rodney, I believe you're on mute.
Very sorry about that. Thank you, John. Yeah, so you know, us farmers don't know how to operate computers, so that's the real problem here. But anyway, as a farmer, I have a rather unique perspective. We do a lot of farm drainage work on our farm and contract doing that as well. So I work directly with wetlands on the land, and have to work through and around regulations from several different agencies. Not just the state regulations, but as well the federal through the Army Corps and the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So there's a lot of different things that we deal with regarding wetlands, and the knee-jerk reaction is, well, if we can remove one layer of those regulations, then hey, that sounds great, because we really don't like doing paperwork. But the truth is, when I sit back and look at it as a farmer, I'm a steward of the land, and it's my responsibility to be sure that what I'm doing as I look at my children and the next generation that's going to farm this land, I need to be sure that I'm protecting our land and water resources, and doing away with the wetland regulations simply flies in the face of that. I mean, it just is a terrible idea for the water quality that we work very hard. You know, we use cover crops and no-till and all sorts of conservation measures on our farm to be responsible and sustainable, to protect the water resources. And these wetlands are just a critical portion of that water cycle and the landscape that really needs to be protected. And I understand the knee-jerk reaction and the desire to do away with a layer of regulation, but I just I don't feel that's in the best interest in the long term of anyone, especially us as farmers. When we look at the impact that we're having on the landscape and protecting the water resources, we really need to keep those protections in place. In addition, removing the Indiana code really does not go as far as a lot of people might think to relieve the burden from us. In reality, it probably removes a layer of protection that we have, where we have a local government entity that we can work with and identify these wetlands, and leaves us solely at the jurisdiction of two federal entities that often have contradictory interpretations of wetlands and things like that. So all in all, I think it's this was put through very quickly, and in general not very well thought out from my perspective as a farmer. I'm in favor of you know, taking time and taking care of some of the implementation issues we have with the wetland laws that we deal with here on the farm, but certainly not of just gutting the Indiana law like has been done here. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak out, and thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. You've been very helpful in the process and continue to be so. So thank you very much. Now here's Kyle Rora, who's Director of Public Policy at Ducks Unlimited. And he's going to talk about how the loss of wetlands affects natural wildlife, ecological diversity and stability, recreation, and our own unique natural heritage. Kyle?
Thank you, John. And good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you all. Just a quick history lesson. Ducks Unlimited was founded in 1937 by concerned waterfowlers who recognized then that the conservation of habitat was the single most important thing we could all be doing to sustain continental waterfowl populations. Senate Bill 389 runs exactly counter to the mission that this organization has maintained for over 80 years. Our volunteers and supporters have dedicated time and treasure to the conservation of wetlands in North America. We've been successful at conserving over 15 million acres over that time span, over 30,000 of which right in the state of Indiana. Wetlands provide really the critical life source for our state's wildlife, both game and non-game species. It's estimated that 50% of Indiana's species of greatest conservation need rely on wetland environments. These wetlands provide excellent places to hunt, fish, and trap. In 2016, the Department of Natural Resources estimated that anglers spent over $1.6 billion pursuing fishing in the state of Indiana, and people who just wanted to go out and then photograph or observe wildlife spent $2.5 billion. Wildlife, hunting, fishing, and other recreational pursuits is big business in the state of Indiana, supports local economies. And so it's incredibly important that we do all we can to conserve wetlands in the state. Policies like those that would be put into place if 389 were to be signed into law would represent the single largest attack on wetlands that I see in the United States today. I cover 21 states for Ducks Unlimited. I'm seeing nothing like this anywhere else. And so wetland loss oftentimes is a death by 1,000 cuts. It's usually not 1 year to the next you notice, but it's over decades you notice the true damaging effects of poor public policy. You look no further than the Kankakee Marsh, what was once estimated to be the single largest inland wetland in the United States. And you all know what we have of that left. So it's important that the governor maintain a great conservation leadership role, veto Senate Bill 389. And as Indra alluded to, let's get to work on crafting good public policy that balances natural resource protections and regulatory relief. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. That's a great point. Now, batting cleanup for us is Jill Hoffman, who is Executive Director of the White River Alliance and was central to developing the memo to legislators that I referenced earlier. Jill?
Thanks so much, John. Good morning, everybody. While I am pleased to join this thoughtful group of leaders, I sure wish I were here to encourage forward thinking aimed at better protecting our wetland resources rather than seeking a veto for something that is so destructive to the safety and sustainability of our shared water future. I'm here representing dozens of central Indiana cities and towns, major manufacturing water users, agricultural interest groups, university researchers, dozens of water resource professionals that make up our membership. I'm here because water is a shared resource. It requires thoughtful and cooperative management. It's a resource that can either provide us with great stability or great instability based upon our choices. Those of us in the day-to-day management of water, even many of our legislators, know that we are facing significant water challenges. This is evidenced by two recent legislatively constituted task forces, one on water infrastructure and another on stormwater. These task forces, if you missed it, have put a spotlight on a looming and staggering need of water infrastructure investment. Roughly $17 billion over the next 20 years, with $2 billion of that need being right away. Also, at the behest of the legislature, the Indiana Finance Authority has undertaken a study of water supply and demand in several key economic strongholds in the state, including the one I represent in central Indiana. They are literally asking the question, do we have enough water? And do we have enough water where we need it the most? These study findings suggest the need for even more water infrastructure investment and even more cooperative solutions about its management. Wow, I'm telling you, given the shaky ground of this water landscape, we decided to start hosting an Indiana Water Summit 2018 because of this increased need to understand the interconnected nature of our water resources across all of those folks like Rodney, the farmers, the manufacturers, the utilities, all of us that are using this shared resource. To lessen protections and to allow unpermitted impacts to one of the most critical parts of our water cycle, wetlands, at this point is irresponsible and short-sighted, and there's really no other way to see that move. When our stormwater managers and our drinking water utilities and our business leaders and our scientists and our engineering community, including myself as a scientist, as well as thousands and thousands of concerned citizens that have signed petitions, when all of those people are throwing caution flags, we need to pay attention. We can do better. We know we have better policy options in front of us. We've presented those in the letter to the governor today, as well as to the General Assembly. the loss of essential and efficient green infrastructure like our wetlands, all of that loss for the promise that somehow more expensive, unfunded, and unreliable gray infrastructure is going to somehow better serve our common needs is a super risky and super unsustainable gamble. I am urging you, Governor Holcomb, please protect our shared water future. This is a complicated conversation, and we need your veto on Senate Enroll Act 389. Thank you.
Jill, thank you very much. I also want to take a moment to thank all of the legislators who voted against this bill. Its passage was not a sure thing, and there were a lot of legislators, both in the House and the Senate, who heard us and understood the issue and voted against the bill as it passed through the process. And I especially want to thank Representative Sue Arrington, Representative David Abbott, Representative Hal Slager, and Representative Doug Gutwein, along with Senators Sue Glick and Mike Kreider, for their leadership in opposing this bill. So with that, thank you for your attention. I know it's a lot to take in, but we wanted to help you understand that this is a complex and important issue. Hoosiers care passionately and have demonstrated this throughout the process. Wetlands are a rich asset for Hoosiers, and we think it's important to protect them. So that's why we're asking Governor Holcomb, on behalf of all of our signatories and tens of thousands of Hoosiers, to veto this bad act. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mark, and thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And I want to quickly re-emphasize something that John mentioned early on, that is that more than 100 organizations signed on to this letter. The advisory said 60, and that was as of Friday afternoon. And so clearly here at the last couple of days, we've had several more organizations sign on. So please use the statistic over 100 for your stories. So at this time, we're going to open the floor for questions. We'll get through as many as possible in the remaining time. And if you have additional questions after that, or you want to request one-on-one interviews with any of the panelists, please contact me. Again, my email is in the chat. So if you have a question, please indicate that in the chat function, and I'll be happy to call on you. Our first question here is from Enrique, who is an Indiana environmental reporter. Are there any previous statements or something the governor has done in the past that makes you think he would veto this bill?
Mark, I'll start real quick, and then anyone else can jump in if they want. Early in this process, Governor Holcomb was quoted when the bill passed the Senate that he was very concerned about the bill at the time. And I would note that both IDEM and DNR have participated in the process of providing information and education and talking with legislators as this goes through. So that indicates that they are very interested in the outcome of this. We don't know what the governor will do. It's his decision to make. We would certainly hope that he will do this, and we're reasonably encouraged by what we'd seen before. So we have good hope, high hope that he will veto this bill.
Can I just add something too, Mark?
Absolutely.
You know, the sportsmen and women community in Indiana are unequivocally opposed to this. All the prominent sportsman groups have signed on. And, you know, Governor Holcomb has displayed leadership in this space in the past. He's a member of the Governor's Sportsman's Caucus, which is a collection of governors around the country who stand with hunters and anglers on issues of importance. We're hopeful that he'll stand with Indiana hunters and anglers on this issue. And so, again, as John said, we're hopeful that the governor will veto.
All right, our next question is from Matt LeBlanc of the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette, and this is a question for Mr. Rulon. You mentioned the knee-jerk reaction to think doing away with regulations would be a wholesale benefit to farmers, but that's not the case. What are some problems you would experience if all regulations were stripped?
Yeah, so yeah, obviously as a farmer, property rights and things like that are a huge concern to me. So anything that is perceived as, you know, the government having control over our property is going to be a red flag for me. But at the same time, as members of our community, what we've found on our farm, and I think a lot of forward-thinking producers in Indiana have found, is that as a general rule, the best long-term policy for us economically also tends to be the best environmental policy. So that's our stance on many of these things, is that when everything is considered, it's going to be very important for us to do both what's right for us fiscally and environmentally. So we deal with a lot of pesticides, fertilizers, soil, that is moved on our farm, and the wetlands are an important part of keeping those items that we have the ability to use out of the water supply. So removing that protection and allowing those things to more easily enter the water supply, really in the long term, is going to open us and expose us to possible liability for things that we're doing on our farm. So it really is a net positive relationship for us to maintain a healthy water cycle and water system, where what finally leaves our farm and goes into the drinking water supply and the general water supply of the state of Indiana is good, clean water.
Thank you.
Mark, could I add to that? I know I wasn't directly asked, but we work with a lot of farmers, and Rodney, if you want to correct me on this, by all means, but several of the members on our board, what they talk about is, a lot of these farms are abutting waterways. So a lot of times regulated drains, and these are outlets for a farmer's tile. They're also sometimes inlets for an irrigation system. So when we have changes take place upstream, you may lose some of either the access to water in the dry part of summer that you need when wetlands are drained, because they're no longer providing water into that, like a sponge letting water out throughout the year. And then the other problem is we throw so much water at these regulated drains. If you don't have an outlet for your tile, if you don't have an outlet for that drainage infrastructure, you're underwater again. And that's the whole point of a lot of what the investment that these farmers have made, is to make sure they have an outlet for their drainage system.
Yeah, Matt, that's exactly right. That healthy water cycle, like I said, is just critical for us on both ends of the perspective. Again, both for that in the springtime when we have excess water and we need an ability to infiltrate that water and remove it from the fields. The wetlands are a critical part of that. Later in the season, much like so many, I know Jill mentioned and several mentioned the shortage overall as a state of water as a resource, and getting that water in where we can use it in the soil and in the aquifers later in the season. So from both ends, it's critical for us to have good functioning wetland resources.
Thank you both. Our next question is from Rebecca with Indiana Public Broadcasting. If the governor does veto the bill, the legislature could still override it. What is the next step should the legislature decide to do so?
I'll take the first stab at this one too. And the situation with the legislature merely adjourning and not actually going sine die like it normally would at this time means that they could come back at any time and handle veto overrides at their will. If that will be certainly very disappointed by the outcome. But the next step will be to work through the commission that is in the bill, the task force rather, that is have deregulation and then have the task force. But we will work through that process and try to help make the case so that the legislature has a more full and robust understanding of the situation. And hopefully we could come back and rectify some of these losses that have occurred. But again, that's a tall hill to climb, and we hope we don't have to.
And Mark, if I could, I'll add to that. Indra Frank with the Hoosier Environmental Council. If the governor does veto this bill, it will give us time to talk to legislators further about sound wetland policy. The bill passed the General Assembly with a fairly narrow margin, and we're hopeful that by continuing that dialogue, during the delay that a veto would give us, we could convince them that an override is not in the state's best interest.
Thank you both. Our next question is from Richard Essex. He asks, name 2 wetlands in Marion County directly impacted by the legislation.
Hi, everyone. It's Jill Hoffman with the White River Alliance. I thought I would jump on this one. This is, I saw that pop up in the chat, and it's an interesting question. I'd like to just start by talking about how poorly mapped our wetlands are in the first place, and really point that out. We know how important their function is, but a lot of them exist on private property and only get mapped when somebody's preparing to develop that property. So I'm sure that you're familiar with several what we would call state regulated or isolated wetlands in many of the park properties that you might encounter. Imagine probably most places you walk over a boardwalk is probably a flatwood wetland that is isolated in terms of its jurisdiction to federal waters. But in those cases, they're in park properties and would likely not be threatened so much by this legislation. But one example that's coming to mind for me is Crown Hill Cemetery, because I think that is a place that is in private hands that will relate to. There are a number of flatwood wetlands in Crown Hill Cemetery that create both a scenic and spectacular experience for people that go there to visit. You might walk some of those and get a sense of what it feels like to be places, and those wetlands would be at threat from this piece of legislation. So again, a lot of them are on private property, but I would, I guess, point you to that one really good example that would give you a sense of the really spectacular nature of the wetlands that exist on private property that are unmapped and therefore would only come to our knowledge in many cases because they were being permitted for impacts, in which case this bill would make them not permitted for impacts anymore, and they would be lost.
Thank you, Jill. Our next question is for Mr. Mearsman, and that is, how much could it cost local and regional governments to replace the functions of wetlands?
Thanks for that one, Enrique. That's a great question. That's what I was asked at the Senate Environmental Affairs Committee meeting. And unfortunately, I don't have a number for that. I do think that there's a way to think about this, though. And again, it's not going to give us a number, but when we look at what's happened in our cities, and I mentioned this in committee, we've essentially lost many of our wetlands already in our cities. And the cost that cities like South Bend are spending to build tanks and tunnels is to mitigate the loss of that. So really that loss of storage capacity, we talk about the wetlands as sponges in the landscape. As we've lost that, we've had to spend a ton of money to figure out how to store them in our cities. Where I think this deregulation could really hit us at the local government level is out in the county, where we're maintaining this rural drainage infrastructure. We've got all these county regulated drains that crisscross the county. And the cost of maintaining them, let alone trying to expand the capacity of them, because we're throwing more water at them, it goes up. So they get more bank erosion. A lot of these are underground tile lines, buried pipes, and you have to build larger pipes as we lose wetlands upstream on the landscape. So I have really been working hard with our counties to try and even get a number for what we're spending now. But I know from a couple of the counties I work with, LaGrange County in particular, they have been deferring the maintenance costs on their drainage infrastructure for a long time, and it's already inadequate. And so, you know, as we lose storage upstream, there's no question that the cost of expanding and maintaining what's there is going to go up. I just don't know exactly how much. It's scary to think about it. In fact, if you talk to the County Surveyors Association for Indiana, they will tell you that the today's cost of building the kind of infrastructure that we've got out there on the landscape right now would be unfathomable. We couldn't afford to do it in today's dollars. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm sorry for not having a number. If anybody else has got one, please.
Well, I don't have a number to add to that, but one of the functions of wetlands, along with the water storage, like Matt was talking about, is that while that water is stored in a wetland, it's soaking in and recharging the groundwater. And it's hard to put a price tag on loss of aquifers, you know, and people's wells drying up. So if we lose wetlands, we also lose their recharge of the groundwater.
Thank you, Indra. That's a great point.
Yeah, I'd like to just chime in on that. Based on some of those studies I had mentioned earlier, the most recent one coming out for the central Indiana area, taking a look at availability and demand, showing us as we look forward into our water future, a deficit in many of our basins, and many of our basins already nearing a zero-sum game in terms of we're taking as much as we're allowing to come back into those aquifer systems. So the future is bleak in a couple of those most highly developed basins. This is really just about the worst time possible to think about letting go of those resources that help stabilize those inputs, the stormwater retention from those areas, but the leveling force that Rodney mentioned through dry times that those wetlands provide. As Matt's mentioning, the dollar figures are staggering. If you start to ask yourself, if we had to recreate that much storage, that much water treatment, and that much groundwater management, we couldn't possibly afford to think about it. So I just, as we're having this conversation, want to recognize that we're having a conversation about the stability of our water future. We're not having a conversation about pesky regulation.
Thank you all for that. And while we're waiting for the next question, we have environmental organizations here, sportsmen and women organizations, and then agriculture also represented here. But I'm wondering if Indra and perhaps John could shed some light on the wide spectrum of different organizations who signed on to this letter and some motivations for that, if you
know. Thank you for that, Mark. This really has been an unprecedented show of unity, and to have, as you mentioned, the environmental conservation groups working with the sportsmen's groups, but we've also had civic organizations, faith groups, the river organizations, as we have here, as well as lake associations signed on to this. There are several municipalities that signed on to this letter as well. So this is my 7th year with the Hoosier Environmental Council. And this is by far the most massive outpouring of support that I've seen for our natural resources and in response to an environmental bill.
Thank you.
I'll echo what Indra had to say as well, because I think it is important to understand that this is really a galvanizing event. From the very beginning, people understood and reacted as such, and they tried to tell their legislators what they thought about this, and unfortunately their concern was not heard ultimately. So I think that to underestimate the passion that people have and the understanding that they have of how important these resources are is a mistake. They get it. We have to help the legislature understand that too.
Thank you both. Our next question is from Enrique. Which wildlife species do you foresee having the most difficulties with wetland loss should the bill be signed into law?
I'll take a quick stab at that, Mark. Just some species off the top of my head. We know the crawfish frog, the Hoosier frog, one of our endangered species, highly reliant on small isolated wetland systems. That species would absolutely be impacted. Some shorebird species, things like the solitary sandpiper, that rely on shallow mudflats in various systems. The American woodcock that migrate through Indiana. And then on the game birds side of things, mallards. Right now, Ducks Unlimited is extremely concerned. We've got declining populations of Great Lakes mallards that we've noticed over the last several years. We're trying to understand really what's happening there with that Great Lakes mallard population, and studies are showing that it's directly related to wetland quality and quantity. Brood success is the biggest factor that leads into success of a population. And so at a time when North America's probably favorite game species of duck, the mallard, is going through population declines in the Great Lakes, a bill like this that would do nothing but reduce wetland acres in Indiana. It's the last thing we need.
If I could, I would add to that. I've had discussions with the International Crane Foundation about this bill, and they point out that, excuse me, 51% of the whooping cranes in the eastern migratory population rely on Indiana wetlands.
Thank you both. Does anyone else have any questions for our panelists? All right, thank you, everyone. Well, again, if you have additional questions for any of the panelists, please send me an email. I would be happy to arrange that. Oh, excuse me, we do have one more here from Enrique. Are there any specific wetland areas believed to be targeted for development, or which do you believe that are most threatened?
I'm not sure I'll have the right answer to this exactly, but I'll tell you my experience as an environmental consultant helping the development community on permitting issues for part of my career. Oftentimes, the exact wetlands that we're talking about deregulating are the ones that are most likely to be threatened, because those do not necessarily, or they do not by nature connect to a navigable waterway, so they don't often get thought of. They can be smaller and they can be more easily drained. So because of that lack of connection to larger waters, the draining of them is easier. We find the ones at most threat probably on the fringe of our developing areas, right? So agriculture that's turning over to development, suburban development, are often at risk. So I don't know that I have a specific area to point you towards, but I would say that a lot of the work that consultants get engaged in is related to isolated wetlands, or simply we want to expand a road and there's a roadside ditch that has formed a wetland. And so there's a lot of these smaller areas that create function in our urban and suburban landscapes that then seem, maybe I would call, easy pickings for development. And at the same exact time, those wetlands are the ones that provide us those little pockets of stormwater management and treatment of things running off of our roadways. So I guess if I were to try to answer that question, I guess look around the place that people want to develop. Those will be the places that are most at risk.
Thank you, Jill. I do want to remind everybody that in the beginning of the chat, if you scroll all the way up, you'll see a link, and that's where we have some photo assets that you can use. There's also some B-roll from this morning up there, a copy of the letter. And if you do want a link to the recording of this press conference, just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to provide that as well. So with no more questions, at this time, we'll conclude the press conference. On behalf of all the panelists, thank you all so much for joining us. I know this is a very important topic and we're very pleased that you're interested in it. Thank you all.